All right, hello everyone, and welcome to the U.S. Heartland China Association's fifth author event. Today we are joined by Peter Walker, who has recently published his book, Powerful, Different, Equal, Overcoming the Misconceptions and Differences Between China and the U.S. Peter is an expert on U.S.-China interactions across a broad range of topics, including politics, economy, trade, history, and culture. He's been a partner at McKinsey for 37 years and has spent almost 4 decades working in and deeply studying China. While going there over 80 times. He's met with business leaders, regulators, experts, and everyday people. His visits led him to become increasingly aware of the disconnect between his firsthand experience in China and the often negative portrayal in the West. Beyond his extensive professional experience, Mr. Walker has dedicated over 15 years to studying Chinese history and culture. This combined perspective gives him an ability to understand what drives Chinese thinking, behavior, reactions, and decisions, and how those perspectives can be different with those of the US. We are also joined today by David O'Brien, who is currently the Vice President of Development and External Affairs at the Peterson Institute for International Economics. So Pete, please take it away. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Yes. Well, thank you for the kind invitation. A special thanks to the governor and to Min and the Heartland China Association. Some of you may be wondering why I'm talking about China, how I first got interested. So let me just take a minute and tell you my story. I went on a long spiritual journey, probably about 35 years ago. And my question I wanted to address was, who died with a smile? So I started by studying the biographies of my favorite authors and composers. And what I discovered is none of them met that criteria. They were highly creative, and produced amazing work, but maybe it's the creativity of genius that creates in the end a tormented soul. But to make a long story short, I discovered in the course of this journey that I really was much more attuned to Eastern values than Western values. And by Eastern values, I mean harmony and balance as a focus, whereas Western values tend to be more dualistic. Winners, losers, good, evil, zero-sum game, etc. So I studied Buddhism and Hinduism, and I felt very much at home with them, but I discovered that they were too specific in the sense of you were one of them or you were not. And I was looking for something that was more inclusive, more and more broadly based. And so I stumbled on a little book called the Tao Te Ching, written by Lao Tzu in about 650 BC, and my journey was over. That little book just gave me a way of thinking and a way of living life that I felt completely comfortable with. So at McKinsey, when you hit age 60, which I did it many years ago, you really have to give up all forms of governance. So I had about a third of my time freed up. I told my assistant I'm going to go to China every 6 to 8 weeks for about a week. I did that for over 12 years, largely serving Chinese insurance companies. That was my specialty at McKinsey and other financial institutions. And one of the things I increasingly realized was the growing disconnect between what I found in China, which were a proud people, very committed to the country, very focused on education, hard work, very focused on family, and generally very upbeat. And what I was reading in the press, the New York Times, the FT, the Wall Street Journal, was constantly focused on the oppressed people of China, the lack of personal freedoms, the corruption in the government. So I really set out to write a book that would go back to what I would call, it's kind of what are the roots of each of the US and China that account for the differences that I was reading about and have really played a key role in shaping who they became. So I did that. And, to make a long story short, what I basically discovered is that the US and China obviously have become the two most powerful countries in the world and very successful by any of the standard measures. But their models are totally different. And those models are rooted in the unique history and culture of each of the two countries. So let me first touch on what I discovered and learned or relearned about the United States. The US, if you go back to its founding, was founded by Europeans looking to escape the lack of freedoms in Europe, the lack of religious freedom, and really a class-driven system where if you were not born into the right class, your economic opportunities were pretty limited. So when the founding fathers set out to write the Constitution of the United States and the Bill of Rights, uh, they really set out with two core ideas in mind. One was maximum personal freedom, which was certainly incorporated in the initial drafting of the document of the Constitution and the Bill of Rights. And the second was a minimalist government. In other words, from the very beginning, the founding fathers set out to create a country that would be defined by its economy and the ingenuity and work ethic of the melting pot of individuals who came over from Europe. And the idea was that government's role should be limited to those things that only a central government could do. So if instead you think about the history of China, uh, you find, first of all, a very core difference in that China has been ruled for over 2,500 years by a very strong central government. And that wasn't an academic choice. That was a necessity because China had two major problems to deal with going back forever. The first one was ongoing invasions from the north, the Mongols, the Manchurians, and other nomadic tribes, and defending themselves against those invasions required a strong central military. The other thing that China had to deal with was constant catastrophes in the form of typhoons, of famine, of earthquakes, etc. So China started out with and has always been a strong central government that really is in charge of all dimensions of the country. The other thing that is fundamental to China is that the durability of Confucian values that goes back to Confucius, which was in roughly 400 BC. So over 20 values are very focused on the collective well-being of the country as a whole. The role of individuals is hard work and education so that they can become better contributors to society on the one hand and their family on the other hand. So this is a very fundamental difference. So the US essentially an individualistic country, and we see that when we think about the different approaches that the two countries take to human rights. In the US, any violation of individual rights is front page news. And we see it in the constant protests that you get in the US against the treatment of minorities. And certainly the US loves to point out the problems that China historically has had with the Tibetans and more recently with the Uyghurs. China doesn't look at it that way. China looks at the well-being of the country as a whole and regards what happens to any single individual as relatively inconsequential as long as the country as a whole is doing well. And China has gone through its own ups and downs. So there have been multiple dynastic changes over the years. And it's interesting when you look at what causes a dynasty to fade away and be replaced by another one. It was always when they, and this is the Chinese phrase, lose the mantle of heaven, which basically means they did not do their job of protecting and defending the country, and they were subject to disasters and did not respond effectively to it. So China has had lots of ups and downs. Obviously, with the fall of the Qing dynasty in 1911, the whole dynastic model was gone. They went through a period of being run really by warlords. Then they had the great civil war of the communists against the nationalists. And then you had enormous upheaval during the Mao era, where you had basically disasters in the form of the Great Leap Forward, which caused over 30 million to die of starvation, the Cultural Revolution, where families were torn apart. But then you had the era begun by Deng, which was in the late 70s, early 80s, where he very much went on a total rebuild of China, and basically enabled the country to pass the US in terms of GDP on a purchase power parity basis, and they'll probably pass us in terms of absolute GDP sometime within the next decade. So a very different model, collective as opposed to individual, strong central government, as opposed to a country that's really run effectively by the business and its economy. And the other thing that's also very important to keep in mind is that the Chinese forever had a value system that says the best and the brightest
Please mute people.
to government service. And in the US, the best and the brightest have always gone into business. Now, obviously, there are many exceptions to this, but by and large, you have to think about the Chinese government as being a very highly managed top-down model that's built on consensus decision-making and is very effective at getting things done. So these two models, while totally different, it's interesting that one of the things I wanted to do was to explore, well, tell me about the people. And I found a couple of really interesting books that describe the character of the Chinese people. And when I read it, I said, you know, this is so much like Americans. So what they talked about was family values. They talked about hard work, get ahead by earning it, sense of humor. Anyone who spent time in China knows that the Chinese are always very kind and helpful. So it really raised the question of, with that much in common and two countries that have been so successful, what is behind the source of tension? And we should keep in mind that the tension is relatively recent. I would say up until probably about 5 or 6 years ago, US and China were partnering on lots of things. The enemy was the Soviet Union. And what triggered the change, I think, was when President Trump realized that he was vulnerable to the response on COVID, which turned out in retrospect to be, you know, highly misguided and flawed, that he would turn the attention against China, and he made China a public enemy #1, and the media clearly went along with that, and there were clearly things you could point to. I mean, the fact that it is a communist country made it easy in the sense that the Soviet Union, as a communist country, was always our Cold War enemy, and so you basically had an anti-China wave that has only gotten stronger, and there really have been three sources of tension that, from my point of view, really don't hold up if you understand the differences in the culture. So one source of tension is human rights. And it's very interesting when you talk to the people in China about how the country is doing, they always talk about the people collectively. So they basically say, our economy is very strong, the standard of living continues to increase, the effectiveness and reach of our education system has never been stronger. And so when you talk to them about, well, tell me about the treatment of the Uyghurs, and the reaction a little bit is, you know, if you go back and understand what is happening with the Uyghurs, you can trace a lot of the tension to Islamic terrorist attacks that took place in China over a course of about a 5 or 6 year period. And from my personal point of view, the reaction to the Uyghurs has been vastly uh, not overblown, but it's been harsh and inappropriate in terms of the degree to which those people are being subjected to uh, confinement and their culture undermined. But from the Chinese government point of view, they would say the collective well-being of the country is better off because we have eliminated Islamic terrorism. But the view on human rights in the US, where we very much focus individually, and this isn't a right or a wrong, this is just a mindset difference, that in the US, if anyone is denied their freedoms or treated badly, it's a very important issue and it's a center stage issue. Whereas in China, they look back and say, our standard of living has never been better. The people are happy, the people support the government, therefore overall we're doing well. So one fundamental difference that probably is never going to change is that collective view versus individualistic view. The second one is the tension around the economy. I think the US would rightly say that the success of the Chinese economy was rooted in American developed intellectual property, especially related to technology. And it was, quote, unfair and inappropriate that the Chinese were able to be so successful on our work. The Chinese point of view is we will always do what's in our best interest. We expect others to do the same. And if you did not protect your intellectual property, which we didn't, why wouldn't we take advantage of it? Now, the reality is the pendulum swings on these issues, as it always does. And so the protection of intellectual property in the US today is far more disciplined and far more effective than it ever was. But it's a little bit too little and too late in the sense that China has already caught up with us economically. And each year is producing 5 to 6 times as many scientists, engineers, mathematicians as the US does. And therefore, China is going to prosper economically going forward, regardless of what we do. But that is an ongoing source of tension. And then the third one is militarily. You know, this one is ironic because if you look at the history of China, China has been one of the most peaceful countries in history. Over the last 1,000 years, the examples of military aggression were twice against Vietnam and once against Korea, both times resulting in a war that ended within a year and with China basically accomplishing nothing. And the US, because we've always had a global view and a mission of spreading democracy and human rights, which is obviously a noble charge, but it's led us into a large number of military conflicts. So I think if the US understood that China is not militarily aggressive, spends a fraction of what we do on defense, that the threat would be seen for what it is. And it's not in China's interest. China is smart. And the idea that you can accomplish anything that matters through war, as we're discovering with Russia and the Ukraine, it's always a lose-lose situation. So those are the three sources of tension. You know, my own feeling is that economically, the US will benefit from competition with China. The US has already taken a lot of actions to invest more than they ever have before as a government in core technologies and sciences, and that's a good thing. So if we could move the economic tensions away from competition and trying to hold the other side down, instead to let's raise our game and beat them at their own game, that would be a win-win for both sides. On human rights, as I said, the issue is not going to change. You really can't reconcile a collectivist view that looks at overall well-being and an individualistic view. They're just polar opposites, and they're not going to change. And militarily, I think the U.S. is just going to realize at some point in time that China is not an aggressor, and even though there is, quote, a partnership between China and Russia, you will see, and it'll become increasingly clear, that China is doing nothing to support the military initiative of Russia. And in fact, I think if they could turn back the hand to time, that partnership would be described in very different terms, largely in terms of China needs oil and gas from Russia, and they want to be able to get that. That has nothing to do with them supporting the invasion of the Ukraine, which was a sovereign country. So that was kind of, my hope for a more constructive relationship going forward is based on the idea that these are going to be the two dominant countries in the world for a long period of time. The reality is that neither side is going to be able to impose its will on the other militarily. It's totally impractical, apart from the distance, but even in terms of just understanding likely consequences. On human rights, we'll just have to live with it. But there are many issues that both countries share in common, and where they could collectively, I think, find areas of cooperation. Climate is obviously one that affects everybody, and where both sides have a huge stake in the game, both in terms of generating, being the source of the problem to some extent, and also wanting to invest in renewables. I think cybersecurity is obviously a common threat. The issue of terrorism is a threat that both companies experience. The issue of pollution and our waters is an issue that we both. So my hope is that ultimately we will come together. The biggest barrier that I see right now is the lack of understanding of China by the U.S. The Chinese understand America quite well. A huge proportion of the leadership in China was educated in the U.S. And they are, have many relationships with the U.S. that go back over long periods of time. At any point in time, there's 600,000 Chinese who are studying in the U.S. But the number of U.S. students studying in China is probably less than 10,000. And so when you listen to commentators on the news in the U.S. talk about China, the understanding is just extremely superficial and generally off base significantly. So with that, let me turn it over to David, and then look forward to a good lively Q&A after.
Hey, Pete, I'm wondering if we could just do maybe a drill down on a couple of issues and then, start a flow of questions here from the audience as well. But Powerful, Different, and Equal, it's a fantastic book. Pete had me read, the manuscript, and I remember reading it in Brazil and was just literally read it in one sitting. But what I came through with this was, here was a person who really tried to walk the middle of the road and to try to enhance understanding of both cultures. And so did this through, as Pete said, family, values, history, democracy, education, business perspectives and the like. And he did this over a period of time here, a long period of time, with lots of interviews and winning trust. And Pete, I'm wondering if you could give a little bit of color here about forming those relationships, the openness when you talk with people on both sides, but especially the Chinese. How did you kind of win their trust and have them open up very objectively to you?
Well, I think first of all, they're so not used to an outsider, especially an American, who has spent a lot of time thinking about and reading about China. So I would say, after I went on my spiritual journey, probably 90% of what I read was China related. It was the old classics like Journey to the West and the Three Kingdoms. It was reading the biographies of the leaders over time, reading all the books on history. So, when I had free time and was in, having conversations over lunches and dinners with Chinese people, some of them in government, some of them in business, I think they just came to understand that I had a deep understanding of China and was interested and very curious about it. So I remember talking to the regulator, who was a top regulator in insurance, where I spent a lot of time. And he said, Pete, if you really want to understand what family means in China, I'd like to invite you to my village during the Spring Festival, which is their major holiday when all the families come together in the hometown of the patriarch. And he said, you will see the 3-year-olds toasting the 6-year-olds, toasting the 9-year-olds, and all the way up to the 80-year-olds. And you will see when we talk about the importance of family, what it means to us. But there were a lot of examples like that. I had someone who was the CEO of a big reinsurance company in China, and I walked him through my experience with Taoism. And he said, you know what? Next weekend, since you're going to be here, let's fly together to Xi'an and go up one of the Taoist mountains, and I'll meet you. I'll introduce you to the number of the people there. So I think the link was probably the fact that it was obvious to them that I had a genuine interest, and I wasn't judging them. I just wanted to understand them.
Yep, great. Pete, let's talk about, if you don't mind, let's get a perspective. And we're talking to a lot of very successful and experienced people that would probably relate to your perspectives. But let's talk about business expectations of developing win-wins, playing, trying to maximize opportunity and the like. What are the successful models out there? What are the expectations from the Chinese? Where have you seen things break down? Where have you seen things work well?
Yeah. Well, if you look at the business relationship, it's a somewhat one-sided relationship in the sense that the number and amount of business that's done by American companies in China is far greater than Chinese companies in America. So, and I'm talking about companies like Microsoft, like Apple, like Kentucky Fried Chicken, which is owned by Yum Yum. There are a number of real success stories, and what explains the success of companies over there is they really invest a lot in understanding culture in China, which means you need to understand the core idea of the Chinese, which is basically, we will always do what's in our best interest and expect you to do the same. So if you're an American company and you go over there, you need to understand that if you make your intellectual property available to them, and that's all they need, they will take it, and you will be out of the picture. So obviously the companies, the US companies that have been very successful over there are keenly aware of what it is they have that the Chinese want. They protect it to a very great extent. The Chinese respect that. And as a result, they wind up building a good relationship. But they also invest a fair amount of time understanding what's different about how business works in China. One of the core differences is the Chinese government, in the form of the Chinese Communist Party, is in charge of China. So you have to understand that if you're going to do business in China, you have to understand local government, you have to understand the provincial government, you have to develop personal relationships with them. And when you do that, you will discover over time that if you provide them with what they want, they will provide support for you, and it will be a win-win relationship. They also, American companies understand the importance of face. So when you communicate with Chinese, you need to do it in a way that is not threatening. So to me, it was very discouraging to see Biden tell China that we are warning you that if you support the Soviet Union in the Ukraine, there will be consequences. Well, that's a threat. Now, I understand exactly where Biden's coming from, but if you understand the Chinese culture, you would have rephrased the question of, we're sure you understand that the Soviet Union has violated the sovereignty of the Ukraine. You understand how important that is to us and to you when they think about Taiwan. And therefore, we're confident that you're not going to be doing anything to overtly support. So the Chinese businesses would have had the conversation that way, and it would have been very well received. When you lead with a "we are warning you," that's back to duality and winners and losers, and that does not play in China. So, David, as you and I have talked, in terms of mending the relationships between the US and China, the people who understand China best are the businesses in the US who were active in China. And they're very successful in China, and they would say it's the most important growth market that they have. And they're very successful because they found a way to work with the Chinese that's good for China and good for them as well. And so, I would hope the businesses would come together and play a more constructive role. But right now, I think the tensions are so high that a lot of businesses are just keeping their head down and saying, we don't want to get identified by DC as a China supporting company, because there'd be negative consequences for us.
Pete, I'm wondering if you could give any example of the relationships of, and maybe even specific companies, if you're comfortable doing that, that have thrived, by taking a very measured, a thoughtful approach, protecting intellectual property, thinking about the market opportunity, et cetera.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think the most significant one is Apple. I mean, Apple is a very, very strong player, and despite very strong competition, and the iPhone costs a multiple of what the portable phones are that are produced in China, but they have established a very strong brand. And I don't know what the earnings number for Apple are in China, but it's an enormous number. I'd say Coca-Cola also has done, and Pepsi, exceptional jobs of building their brands. So consumer companies, Kentucky Fried Chicken is probably the most successful fast food company there is in China. But the common denominator of all of these companies is they have good relationships with the government. They frequently have partners that they've created win-wins. They have joint ventures where each side is making important and unique contributions. And they're careful on the issue of face, that how they talk about China and how they treat China is with respect. And when you do that, you will get respect back. So, and then obviously there are many US companies that are not active in China, but where China is a very critical part of the supply chain. So I don't know what proportion of Walmart's products are made in China, but it's probably, around 30%. It's a very substantial number. And a lot of people say, well, the US company should not be doing business in China. Well, there's a huge competitive advantage that China has in terms of their ability to manufacture on a low-cost basis. And so if Walmart stopped importing from China, you would see a material increase in inflation in the US, and everybody would pay a price.
Okay. All right. I'm monitoring the questions that are coming in on the chat. So if people want to go ahead and submit them, Pete, how about if I try to summarize a couple of these, and get a reaction. Yang Yang wrote, and she said, "Wow, your conclusion observation resonates with me, who understands and loves both countries." And then her question is, a perception that the U.S. media is biased against China. What's your perspective about where the media is coming from, Pete?
Yeah, no, there's no question the media is absolutely biased against China. And you could just see it in headlines, and you could see it in what subjects they choose to write about. But we have to keep in mind that those companies are for-profit companies. Their simple measure of success is how many eyeballs we're going to be able to capture, and what that's going to do for us in terms of advertising. And I think if you go back to Trump's effort to demonize China, which, while from my point of view totally misguided, they have been very successful in terms of creating an aura that China is an evil empire on multiple dimensions, and so you can paint them as militarily our greatest threat, even though the facts would show that historically it's completely contrary to Confucian values, is completely contrary to their own track record. But can you read all the time articles about the threat that China poses to Taiwan? Yes, you can. And do many of them paint a picture of China likely invading Taiwan? Yes, you can see that. I think that is highly unlikely, because if you go back to The Art of War, which was written by a very famous Chinese general, the whole spirit of that is the best war is one where no one ever fires a weapon. And therefore you look to win with influence over time and very indirectly. So yeah, going back to the core question, if you literally just took the FT is more balanced. But if you took the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times and said, let me look at the last 100 articles on China, and then ask yourself the question, what are the underlying assumptions they're making about China? You would discover that 95% of them are negative. And I would argue the vast majority of them are wrong and misguided against where China actually is.
Okay, great. So Peter, a couple of other questions. One now on the kind of the other side of the media here. Do you think China's silencing of journalists has been partially responsible for the America's media sentiment towards China?
Yeah, I think, I mean, a lot of, you really have to go back a little bit to the evolution of the Chinese posture vis-a-vis the US over time. I think that the relationship and journalism in China was pretty open. Now, it's not open in the sense that you can directly attack the Chinese government, but it's actually quite self-critical. So one of the papers I read, whenever I was in China, was the China Daily, which is, and that along with the People's Daily. There were many articles in there that were pointing out critical things about China. I remember reading an article saying that that something like 70% of the newly appointed judges in China were not members of the Communist Party. And the article was, and this is a good thing for our country. So I think the press, now what the press cannot do is come out and say, the government policy is wrong, we don't agree with it, and we think people should push back against it. Whereas in the US, that's one of the roles that the press plays, and they're very outspoken, and it's really impossible to muzzle them. So in China, it's not totally open, but it's a lot more open than most Americans would give it credit for being.
Great. Pete, there's a whole slew of questions that have come in, really, really good ones. So let me cover one more relative. So this is from Min. The US business community has been quiet or has been quite muted while bilateral relations soured. Why was that?
Yeah. Well, yeah. I mean, first of all, the observation is absolutely true because no one is better positioned to help the American public understand the reality of China than businesses in America who are active in China, because they would say we play with a level playing field. Our profits have been very good. We have been able to protect our intellectual property, et cetera, et cetera. And most of them would say the tension between the US and China today, largely driven by the US, has absolutely hurt them in their business in China. And the sooner it's resolved, the better. So the question is why is the business community being silent? I think it's simply the fear that if you speak out, and we all know that the way the media works today, it's sound bites. It's not about a reasoned, fact-based discussion of what's actually going on. So if you have the president of a company who basically says China represents one of the important growth opportunities for us, you would be hearing from congressmen who generally know very little about China that so-and-so company is getting in bed with China, and we need to watch them carefully because they may be making some of our trade secrets available. And if you talk to the company, they'd say, we never said that. We don't agree with that. But as you know, with TV talk shows and everything else, you don't have recourse. So companies have learned that being thoughtful and saying what they think is not protected. And that if it goes on Fox News and it gets twisted in a way that doesn't make any link to reality, they have no comeback. They can write a letter or whatever, but it doesn't matter. It's already out there.
Yep. Okay. So Pete, let me turn the questions here towards business there, and I'll try to group a few of them. But Alex Bowles writes, as someone with extensive business background, what are your thoughts on the structural impediments to conducting business in China, such as forced joint ventures, America's being forced to use variable interest entities, as an investment vehicle rather than owning direct shares, et cetera? So any views on that question?
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, first of all, if you go back to my comment, which I think it's important that the quality of people in senior government position in China is extraordinarily high. So these are very well educated global citizens who understand what they're trying to get done, and they make very smart decisions. So if you're a company with a unique capability that doesn't exist in China, in an arena where the China really wants it, and a great example would be chips. I mean, China is 10 years plus behind in terms of the production of nano chips, which really are the engine of cell phones and all the other microelectronic devices. But if you have that capability and China really wants it, they will ask you for subsidies. They will ask you for all kinds of things. All you have to do is say, we don't need to do that. We know you need what we've got. Here's what we think is a fair proposition. If you go into China and you don't have anything that is strategically important to them, they're going to view you as simply wanting another bite of the apple. And in exchange, they will look to get price concessions. They will tell you who your primary suppliers ought to be. They'll basically do everything they can to make sure that the economics are in China's favor and not in yours. So what I always tell companies that want to build their operation in China, just be very clear what you have that they want and protect it. And if you do that, they will find you and you will create a win-win. if you're just looking to go there as another Me Too player and producing the same thing that Chinese companies can easily produce, you're not going to be successful.
Okay. So Alex goes on to write a second part of the question, which I think is really interesting. We allow Chinese nationals, for example, to purchase real estate, but to my understanding, it would be significantly harder for a foreigner to do this in China. Do you think that some of this promotes biases that we see, and is it justified compared to the economic benefits that U.S. companies are seeing in the Chinese space?
Yeah. Well, I'd go back to my point on do you really have a strategic competitive advantage? At the end of the day, going back to the notion that China will always do what's in its best interest, one of the things that China as a government is very concerned about is the flight of capital. There's an enormous amount of what I would call new money in China, of first generation business owners who have been able to tap into that enormous market very successfully. And they understand that the Chinese government is totally in control of the overall economy. So what you would do if you were them is to look to move a lot of your capital to safe havens. So a lot of the constraints that you see that the Chinese government is placing on things like doing real estate deals in the US is recognizing that it's really a way of moving capital out of China, which is not in China's best interest from a currency point of view and an economic point of view. But again, if the US business community bonded together and had a value proposition that really worked for China and said, okay, you want access to our nano chips, here's what we want from you to make it a level playing field. Could you have that negotiation with China? Absolutely. And what will guide China's decision-making process? It'll be whatever's in their best interest. So if you've got something they need, you will be able to cut a fair deal.
Okay, excellent. Savannah Riley writes, Pete, what's your opinion on China's handling of COVID-19 at present? And how do you see the recent lockdowns affecting the Chinese economy as well as the American economy? And how do you see this continuing to unfold?
Yeah. Well, I think that's a great question because obviously COVID has evolved from a significant hospitalization, significant death disease to a modest flu-like symptoms with far lower hospitalization and deaths and far higher levels of contagion. So if you look at what they did in Wuhan, which is where the first major outbreak was, you really have to applaud what China did, because at the end of the day, while the lockdown is something that we find in America abhorrent because it's a restriction of personal freedoms, the net result is China to date, and this has been verified internationally, has probably less than 10,000 deaths from COVID. With a population of 1.4 billion, we have recorded 900,000 deaths, and those are the ones that are labeled COVID. If you look at an analysis that I think is very interesting and powerful of, quote, unexplained deaths. So if you look at historic trends in death rates, and you look at the unexplained in the US, that 900,000 goes to probably 3 million. So in terms of outcome, you really can't argue with the overall strategy that China has taken, which was a zero tolerance view. I think what China is struggling with now, and it's a big deal for them, is that because we have a far more contagious strain, and because does not have high severity, the ability to lock down a city the size of Shanghai, I think they're discovering is just well beyond, it's impossible to do. You cannot feed 26 million people and keep them under control in a total lockdown state. So my guess is that the Chinese government today is taking a very hard look at what their response 2.0 is going to look like. And I think it's going to be far closer to what the US has been moving towards. And it is very interesting because I talked to someone from China recently, and I said, you know, it's interesting that while you guys do lockdowns, which in the US are totally unacceptable from a cultural point of view, you do not mandate vaccines, which the US has done in a number of different arenas. And it seems to me that's kind of the easy thing to do because it's in everybody's best interest that especially the elderly who are the most vulnerable get vaccinated. But if you look at the higher death rates that are occurring now in Hong Kong and in other major cities, a lot of it is attributed to a very low vaccination rate. And some of it's probably attributable to the fact that their vaccines are not as effective as the US vaccines have been.
Okay. All right, so Pete, why don't we're coming up to the top of the hour. There's several other questions here, and I'm not sure we'll get Min and Governor Holden and Jason's advice as to how to answer those. But you know, Pete, coming back to a question here, you know, McKinsey was known as a problem solver, and so what are some of the problem-solving solutions that you'd give to governmental and to business leaders in US and China?
Yeah, well, I mean, the first one is accept the fact that China is who it is and has evolved very naturally to its current model over 2,500 years, and it's not going to change. Because that mindset, if you just could instill that mindset, and I'm not saying you should like it or dislike it, just accept the fact that it is what it is, accept the fact that the Chinese people's approval rate of their government is a multiple of that number in the US when you look at international research that's been done by the Pew Foundation and by Edelman. So one of my first recommendations would be understand the history and culture and accept the fact that China won't change, because there are a lot of the initiatives that are taken against China are in the spirit of we will force you to change, and it's just not going to happen. And the way face works in China, as soon as they feel you think you can change them, even if it's not in their interest to do something, they will defy you. I mean, it's just part of face and the way they are. The other thing I would do is I would take advantage of the fact that we have so many well-managed, successful companies doing business in China in a pure win-win way. And I would ask those companies, what could we do as a government to help you build a stronger position in China? And then I would go to the Chinese companies, many of whom have some unique capabilities. So if you look at Alibaba, if you look at Baidu, if you look at TikTok, if you look at Tencent and their effectiveness with WeChat, there's an awful lot of consumer-based technology in China that is extremely well designed and would be very successful in the US. Because I think you've got to create a two-way street. So I would definitely turn to the business communities on both sides and ask the question, what really are the barriers? So when you have the US government saying, we're not going to approve your acquisition of an insurance company because you're going to get access to their consumer data, and we think that's a security risk. Well, that is a totally ridiculous argument. I mean, and I spend my life in the world of insurance. So I'm saying, okay, so you now know that this policyholder is this old, has a family that looks like this, that makes this, what are you going to do with that relates to American security? So there are a lot of barriers that have been put up by what I would call grandstanding congressmen who are looking to make a name for themselves by being the toughest one in town on China and creating legislative proposals that make no sense for anybody. But what it requires is a mindset change, and it really starts in Washington. And like I said in the prior question, the reason that the businesses are not stepping out is they're going to trigger an irrational response that could hurt their brand and they just don't want to go there. They don't see, they see enormous downside and they don't see a commensurate upside.
Yep, exactly. Okay, so Pete, we got a note from Jason saying lots of great questions here. Let's keep it open for another 15 minutes or so. But I'm wondering, Pete, if you would mind giving some impressions. You and I had the opportunity to speak with Min and understand the mission of US Heartland China, understand the pragmatism, the business community, seeking win-wins and the like. I'm wondering if you can come away with, some of the advice that you just gave here about what creates win-wins and maybe a reflection back to this audience about what they seem to be doing right and things that you would encourage them to continue to do.
Yeah. Well, what I love about the mission of Heartland is the fact that it's very decentralized and it's really promoting people to people contact. Because, the number of people I've met in America who say, I've spent a lot of time with Chinese people. They are great people, but I really don't like the government. And so you get this dichotomy between the people who see Chinese people one-on-one, where you go back to the characteristics that I talked about, which is sense of humor, kind, hardworking, family-oriented, all those good things. When you deal with Chinese people individually, that's what you see. And then you kind of say, well, why is it we have a problem with China? And I like to say that, if it's really rooted in the demonization of China that goes back about 5 years ago to divert attention away from the problems that we were having with COVID, really for political reasons and no other reasons. Mm-hmm. And so I think Heartland's approach of let's get as much people-to-people contact as we can at the neighborhood level, at the school level, at associations, sports, anything that brings people together. Because, my experience after all my trips to China is when you meet Chinese people, they know how to have fun. They're very hardworking, very high energy, but they also have a great sense of humor. They're very kind and open. And, I remember having an experience where one of the interviews I was doing was a senior guy at Peking University, one of the top colleges in China. And at the end, he said, Pete, a good friend of mine is in charge of education in one of our major provinces, and he'd love to meet you. So we went out and had a classic Chinese banquet dinner. And of course, like the Chinese always do, he brings gifts and drink a lot of Mao Tai. And it turns out, he said, Pete, my daughter, Yu Yang, is at the University of Pittsburgh. And could you kind of keep an eye on her for me? So I called up Yu Yang and I met her. She's a great kid. She's went to Northwestern and is now working in the U.S. And all I did were the little things, just how you doing, anything we can help you on. If you're thinking about what grad school you should go to, use this as a sounding board. I'll put you in touch with the right people. And Yu Yang found out that my daughter Sarah was going over to China because she speaks Mandarin, and she was going to spend a semester at Peking University. Well, her father found out about that, organized a big banquet for her with her friends who were traveling over there, and then said, this is Golden Week, where everyone shuts down for a week. Where haven't you been in China you'd like to go? And he basically took her around China for a week. And, and his general attitude was, anything I can do for you. But that's the way the Chinese are. As you know, David, the phrase guangqi and relationships in China are everything. So I think the idea of Heartland really focusing on how do you make those connections at the people level, at the business level, so that people can get to know China through its people is a great way to go at it. The challenge a little bit is that the demonization of China is institutionalized, it's grounded in the government. And so winning the war one person at a time, while is a constructive and important contribution, we have to ultimately deal with the core issue of demonization,
Right.
which we see manifesting itself, in New York with attacks on Asians, literally just walking down the street, and some misguided person decides that the quote, they are the enemy and they need to beat them up.
Yeah. Pete, on that point of enhancing understanding and getting to, kind of really the basis for a constructive relationship, would there be any advice here that you could give the experts in the federal government? Like, what are we missing right now? What do we need more of? Are there any examples out there? I know there's John Huntsman, Terry Brandt said, any number of others, but thought about the type of leaders, the type of experiences we need at that federal, state, local government level.
Yeah. Well, I guess I'm much more optimistic at the state level than I am at the federal level. I think the airtime is going to a number of high-profile senators and congressmen who are clearly riding the demonized China wave, and they get a lot of press, and so and I'm not sure, as long as they think that's in their interest and it's going to help get them reelected, it's going to be very hard to change that. But like you said, there are many more who actually have real substantive experience with China. And like I said earlier, I think organizing the business community is the best way to go at it. And the reason I mentioned states is obviously states are constantly competing to help develop their own business basis. So I think when Chinese companies come over with high talent people and with capital and find an opportunity to build a business in a win-win way and create jobs in the US. I love the documentary. I don't know whether many of you saw it, but the documentary of one of the largest auto parts players in China, where the owner basically bought up a couple of factories from Ford and GM. And early in that documentary, it kind of showed the union saying, well, you're going to have to do this, you're going to have to do that. And the owner said, look, let me be very clear. I want to build a great business, and if it's successful, you will be successful. But we got to get on the same team. And at the end of the documentary, you saw how successful this business had become, how many people they had hired, and how supportive the labor was, the American labor, of what the owner had done, because he basically kept his promises that he increased the wages, he provided benefits, and he created an environment where they felt very satisfied and rewarded. And so, that to me is much more likely to happen with states getting actively involved in the process, and as opposed to changing the tone in Washington, which I think is just going to take time.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. I'd love for Governor Holden to come in here when we wrap up and maybe give his perspectives on that. I certainly see that firsthand. I live with my family in Park City, Utah, and Utah has been very progressive here in terms of its relationships, language, welcoming, and as a result, the business climate and the sense of trade has flourished. Okay, so I think we are just about at time, Pete. Any wrap up comments here?
No, I mean, this is kind of a mission for me, and so I'm not going to be letting go of this issue. I'll go at it any way I can, and enlist as many people to help as I can. As I said, I do think that what we have going for us is what Min is really doing with Heartland, which is that people-to-people connection. Because you can't spend time with Chinese people without coming away and saying these are great people, and they are not enemies, and we need to create a positive environment. And but I'm a realist. I mean, I understand the collective weight of the anti-China media out there and chunks of the federal government are just going to take time to overcome. So one of the things I would certainly hope is that vis-a-vis China and Russia, that China distances itself from what's going on in China in a more visible way than they have so far. And I know it's difficult for them because they're so dependent on Russian energy. But I do think China has invested a lot. If you look at the Belt Road Initiative, in terms of trying to win over people around the world and creating, constructive relationships. And, if you look at what China has done in infrastructure in developing countries, it's amazing. I mean, they're really changing them beneficially in very important ways. But it's going to be a journey. I mean, I have no illusions that, this is 6 to 12 months away. This is not going to go away, and so we have to all collectively keep working on it.
Yeah. Well, Pete, this has been fantastic. So Heartland China, thank you so much for this opportunity. I think what the audience can experience at some level is is just kind of the wonderful intellectual and human experience you have by being close to Pete Walker. And as you can tell, he studies situations. He takes a human perspective on it, very practical perspective, looks at the history, and it's always a joy to interact with him. So, Pete, thank you on this really great presentation. I encourage people to read Powerful, Different, Equal. It is a reasonably quick read, but very, very engaging. And it just gives, just a richer perspective of the relationships and our shared colleagues around the world, okay? And just helps with understanding. So with that, back to Governor Holden, Min, Jason.
Yes, thank you. Can you guys hear me?
Yes, very well.
Great. Well, I know Governor Holden is coming back online, so maybe
Yes.
Jason, you can help him. Great. I don't see your camera on, but thank you so much, Pete. And again, Dan, I can't express enough how appreciative we are. You do have the ability to go through so much material and condense it in a way that people can really connect with. So we looking forward to share the replay recording, but we do have some members who might be popping in and get on camera and ask you additional questions. Hopefully it's okay.
Sure.
Peter, David, am I on?
Yeah,
Yes.
we can hear you, Governor Holden.
Okay.
And we can see you as well.
Oh, great,
Well,
great.
that's not a plus, but but let me just say, I couldn't have been more impressed about a conversation with anybody I've ever had dealing with China. I just thought it was exceptional. To give you a little bit of my background and how I got involved in all of this, Peter, is I was chair of the Midwest Governors Association, and I watched particularly the automotive industry leaving the heartland of the United States, going to the East Coast and going overseas. So I started thinking about what can we do to turn that around? And nobody was really talking about China at that point in time. And so I made my first trip to China, announced that we were going to try to set up a relationship and build that relationship. My wife and 2 sons went with me on that trip, and I will never forget. The teacher came up to me quietly after I'd made my comments and said, "I understand that your youngest son is turning 10 on this trip. Is that true?" And I smiled and of course said, "Yes, it is." And she said, "Well, some of the students have a little gift for him. Would that be okay?" And what's a father to do? You say, "Sure." And so one at a time, they came up and presented John D with a little gift. And I turned to my wife and I said, "I can work with these people." Because it's really the humanity of it.
Yeah.
Another story that always rings to me. I've been active in the American Legion, Missouri Boys State and Girls State for over 40 years. A few years ago, a gentleman I know married a lady from China, brought her and her daughter over to live in St. Louis, and her daughter got picked by the school to go to the American Legion Girls State program. And through that process, she got elected to be the governor of Missouri Girls State. And then they realized that she wasn't even an American citizen. She was a Chinese citizen, which tells me that you put the right people in the right position, you can have tremendous success. And so that's really fundamentally what we're trying to do with this organization. And we couldn't have a better participant in that than Min Fin in the work that she does. And I first of all believe very highly that women are more successful at changing attitudes than men are in general, and that they need to sit at the table like everybody else. When I came in as governor of Missouri, I found out that Missouri was 41st out of the 50 states with women in leadership positions. When I left office, we ranked number 5. And I did the same thing in the African-American community, the Hispanic community, because if we're going to be successful going forward in this world, we've got to be much more reflective of the world values and people than we've been in the past.
Yep.
The governor, yeah. We got a bunch of questions. We have about 10 minutes. Sorry. I was going to just really quickly mention Governor Holden was invited to give a talk through the World Fair Council St. Louis and about China. People have a lot of questions. So Governor Holden, maybe we can extend the invitation to invite our speakers to join you at the World Fair Council talk. I think they have some unique. Yeah, so Pete, we will follow up with you and David with that separate talking engagement. But again, given David's experience at TU, highly reputable think tank institute, and sorry we couldn't share this wonderful resource you shared. Could you share quickly your organization and this forecast? That would be very helpful for the members and the audience.
Yeah. Thank you, Min, and thank you, Governor Holden. Actually, a couple points here, if you don't mind. The point that we are talking about, the connection of the human nature connection, this is very personal to me. My wife and I adopted 4 special needs kids from China. And so all of this that Pete has taught me along the way that we were all talking about, I see this up close and personal in my home every day, and with our friends and family and the people that you connect with. And, just the goodwill of the communities going back and forth, and as it relates to special needs children and some of the medical advances. I sit on a board called the Children of China Pediatric Foundation, which is effectively a Doctors Without Borders. And they very, very quietly take the very best doctors from both China and from the US, and they're seeking to do good with that, with that indigent community. And it is just spectacular when you see this behind the scenes, when you work with teams in business. I was a longtime partner with EY, but before I retired, I actually was asked to lead the China business unit, and I saw that with fantastic people. So now what I'm working on, and Min, thank you for referencing it. I'm with the Peterson Institute for International Economics. Peterson Institute is actually named after Pete Peterson, who was a Midwest extraordinary business person.
Chicago?
He was actually started in Kearney, Nebraska. Okay. And he was the son of Greek immigrants. But to show you, kind of where he took his career in the world, he was the CEO of Bell & Howe. He was the U.S. Commerce Secretary. He then went on to become the CEO of Lehman. He was the founder of Blackstone, which is one of the largest private equity firms in the world. But Pete actually was a tremendous philanthropist as well, and formed the Peterson Institute for International Economics. So this is actually houses, the array of literally the best economists in the world, and nonpartisan, academically intensive research. And so we've just put out our forecast, which I can share with you, Min, Governor, Jason, you could share with your audience, but I would encourage your members, if they're looking for, unbiased, nonpartisan economic data and perspective, and also perspectives on US-China, it is a tremendous resource. We'd love to make that available.
We'll do.
Thank you. So at this time, we do want to give some time to USHCA members and special guests. So to our non-USHCA members, to our very large audience out there, thank you so much for joining. At this time, your screen will prompt you to join a breakout room if you are one of our members. So when that comes up, please go ahead and click that, and we'll reconvene in a smaller room for about the remaining 10 minutes. So let's continue our discussion there. Thanks everyone so much for joining today.